Victor Reinhardt walked across the gleaming stage of Carnegie Hall, his footsteps echoing in the hushed silence. 3,000 people held their breath. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the rustle of a program disturbed the moment. Victor didn't rush. He had earned this silence, this reverence. At the magnificent grand piano, he adjusted the bench with practiced precision, not for comfort, but for effect. The audience needed to see the ritual, the preparation of a master. He stretched his fingers, rolled his shoulders, and finally placed his hands above the keys, hovering there just long enough for the tension to build. Then he played. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall. The piece was considered one of the most difficult in existence, but Victor made it look effortless. His hands seemed to float above the keyboard, each finger finding its note with perfect precision. When the orchestra joined, they followed his lead, not the other way around. In the third row center, an old professor of music from Juilliard leaned toward his wife. "It's not human," he whispered. "No one should be able to play like that." Backstage, Victor's manager, Sophia, checked her watch. 2 hours until they needed to leave for the airport. Tokyo tomorrow, then Vienna, then Berlin. At 43, Victor should have been slowing down. Instead, he played more concerts than ever, each venue larger than the last, each ticket price higher. The applause when Victor finished was thunderous. He stood bowed deeply, his face a careful mask of humble gratitude. Inside, he felt nothing. Later, in the back of the town car headed to his penthouse, Victor loosened his bow tie and stared out at the New York streets. His reflection in the window looked tired. "The governor was there tonight," Sophia said, not looking up from her tablet. "Wants to host a private event next month. Very exclusive, very expensive." Victor nodded absently. "The Berlin Philharmonic called again. They're offering to rename their main hall after you if you'll commit to a 5-year residency." Again, he nodded. Sophia finally looked up. "You haven't heard a word I've said, have you?" "I heard Governor, Berlin, more money, more acclaim." He turned to face her. "What's the point of it all, Sophia?" She blinked, genuinely confused. "The point? Victor, you're at the absolute peak of your profession. You're the greatest pianist alive, possibly the greatest who's ever lived. That's the point. And what more could you possibly want?" Victor turned back to the window. How could he explain the emptiness that had been growing inside him? The sense that his technical perfection had become a cage rather than an achievement. In his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Victor poured himself a glass of whiskey and walked to the wall of awards. 3 Grammys, an honorary knighthood from the Queen, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, framed reviews declaring him transcendent, superhuman, the definition of perfection. He took down one of the Grammys, feeling its weight in his hand. He remembered the rush of winning the first one 15 years ago. Now they sent him one almost every year, and he barely bothered to attend the ceremony. Victor set the award down and walked to his personal practice room. Inside sat a custom Steinway worth more than most people's homes. He'd helped design it himself, the action perfectly calibrated to his touch. He sat and placed his hands on the keys but didn't press them. When had it happened? When had music, once his greatest joy and deepest passion, become just another task to complete? He played a simple C major scale, the first thing every piano student learns. His fingers moved with machine-like precision, each note exactly the same volume, the timing perfect to the millisecond. That was the problem. There were no flaws left for him to fix, no challenges left to overcome. He could play anything put in front of him, no matter how difficult, no matter how complex. But why play at all? What was he trying to prove, and to whom? He closed the piano lid gently and returned to his living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city lights. His phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, already confirming details for tomorrow's flight. Always the next city, the next concert, the next standing ovation. The wheel kept turning, but Victor had begun to wonder if it was actually going anywhere. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, Victor dreamed of playing in an empty hall, his fingers moving but no sound coming from the piano. 3 weeks later, Victor stood on the stage of Suntory Hall in Tokyo. The concert had been sold out for months. People had flown in from all over Asia just to hear him play. Critics had flown in from Europe. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Victor began with Bach, then moved to Beethoven. His body went through the familiar motions while his mind drifted elsewhere. He'd played these pieces so many times he didn't need to think about them anymore. Halfway through the Beethoven sonata, he realized he'd been thinking about what he might have for dinner later. That was the moment it hit him. He was bored. Bored during one of the most challenging piano compositions ever written, in front of 2,000 people who had paid small fortunes to hear him play it. Something must have changed in his playing because the conductor gave him a curious look. Victor forced himself back to the present moment, forced himself to at least pretend he was engaged with the music. After the concert, a reception was held in his honor. Victor shook hands, accepted compliments, signed programs. A young pianist no more than 16 approached him with shaking hands. "Mr. Reinhardt, your performance tonight was... I have no words. I've been playing piano since I was 4, practicing 8 hours every day. And I know I'll never be able to play like you just did." Victor looked at the boy, saw the mixture of awe and discouragement in his eyes, and felt a stab of something like guilt. "What's your name?" Victor asked. "Hero," the boy said. "Hero, do you love playing?" The boy looked confused but nodded vigorously. "Then keep playing because you love it. That's more important than being the best." Even as the words left his mouth, Victor realized how far he had strayed from his own advice. When was the last time he had played for love rather than for perfection? Back in his hotel suite, Victor sat alone at the window looking out at the Tokyo skyline. Sophia had gone to bed hours ago, but sleep eluded him. A knock at his door startled him. It was well past midnight. When he opened the door, no one was there. Only a cream-colored envelope on the floor. Victor picked it up, turning it over in his hands. No name, no address, no stamp, just the finest paper he'd ever felt, sealed with dark red wax stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize. Victor broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of the same cream-colored paper. The handwriting was flowing and elegant, written with what must have been a fountain pen. "To the foremost pianist of our age," it began. "Your mastery of the Western classical tradition is beyond question, but there are melodies in this world that follow different rules, that challenge even those of your caliber. If you seek to remember what it means to be humbled by music, to struggle, to learn, to truly feel again, come to the place on the enclosed map. A guide will meet you in the village." A small hand-drawn map was included on the back of the letter, showing a remote region in Nepal near the Tibetan border. A monastery, the letter explained, housed musical artifacts dating back nearly 1,000 years. Victor's first instinct was to throw the letter away. Some kind of prank, surely. Or worse, a trap to lure him to a remote location. But something in the wording nagged at him. To remember what it means to be humbled by music. Whoever wrote this understood exactly what was missing from his life. He read the letter again, then once more. Each reading made the idea seem simultaneously more absurd and more necessary. A monastery in Nepal? He had concerts scheduled for months ahead. Sophia would have a fit. Yet for the first time in years, Victor felt something stir inside him. Curiosity, interest, maybe even excitement. He picked up his phone to research flights to Kathmandu. Sophia stared at Victor as if he had lost his mind. They sat in his Tokyo hotel suite, the morning sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the breakfast spread neither of them had touched. "Nepal?" She repeated the word like it was a disease. "You want to cancel 6 months of concerts. Concerts people have already bought tickets for, so you can go to Nepal to find some monastery that might not even exist?" Victor slid the mysterious letter across the table. "Read it." Sophia picked it up reluctantly, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting. "This could be from anyone," she said when she finished. "A fan, a stalker, someone who wants to rob you or worse. Who would go to this much trouble? The paper alone must cost more than most people earn in a day. Rich people can be crazy too, Victor." Sophia rubbed her temples, a gesture he'd seen thousands of times when she was stressed. "You have the Vienna Philharmonic in 2 weeks. The Berlin recording session. The White House performance next month. Cancel them. You can't just, I can, and I will." Victor stood up and walked to the window. Tokyo sprawled below him, a city where he was treated like royalty, where his face appeared on billboards advertising luxury watches he'd never wear. "I'm going, Sophia. Either help me make the arrangements or I'll do it myself." She looked at him for a long time. In the 15 years they'd worked together, she'd never seen him like this. Finally, she nodded once. "I'll make the arrangements, but I'm telling everyone you're taking a health break. Mental exhaustion." Victor smiled wryly. That's not far from the truth. 3 days later, Victor found himself standing in Kathmandu's chaotic airport. No private car waiting, no hotel staff rushing to take his luggage. Just noise and heat and people hurrying past without a second glance. The anonymity was both disorienting and refreshing. He'd brought only what would fit in one suitcase and a backpack. Even so, as he made his way to the small lodge where he'd spend the night before continuing his journey, he wondered if he'd packed too much. The streets were narrow, crowded with motorbikes and pedestrians, the air thick with spices and exhaust. At the lodge, the owner recognized his name but showed no particular reverence. "Ah, the piano player," he said in accented English. "You go to Tengboche? Very far, very high, hard to breathe." He tapped his chest and made a wheezing sound. "You sure you're not too old for this?" Victor, who swam daily and had a personal trainer, felt a flicker of irritation. "I'll manage," the owner shrugged. "Your guide come tomorrow, early." He pointed upward. "Sun there. You ready?" That night, in a room that was clean but simpler than any he'd stayed in since college, Victor lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Kathmandu. Dogs barking, distant music, voices in languages he couldn't understand. His phone had no service and the lodge had no Wi-Fi. He was cut off from his normal world in a way that would have seemed like a nightmare a week ago, but now felt strangely liberating. The guide, a compact man named Dorje with weathered skin and a quiet demeanor, arrived before dawn. He looked Victor up and down, taking in his expensive hiking boots and brand-new backpack, and said something in Nepali that sounded suspiciously like a sigh. "We take bus first," he said in English. "Then we walk. Many days." The bus ride was 7 hours of jolting discomfort on mountain roads that seemed too narrow for the ancient vehicle. Victor sat crushed between Dorje and an old woman with a basket of chickens on her lap. By the time they reached the small village where the hiking would begin, his tailbone ached and his head throbbed from the altitude. "We sleep here," Dorje announced. "Tomorrow we walk." The village consisted of a cluster of stone buildings and a small tea house where travelers could sleep on thin mats on the floor. Victor's suitcase, already an object of amusement on the bus, was now clearly an impossibility on the mountain trails. "What can I take?" he asked Dorje, looking at the contents of his luggage spread across the floor of the tea house. Dorje pointed to Victor's backpack. "That, nothing more." Victor spent an hour deciding what was truly essential. Warm clothes, basic toiletries, the letter, carefully folded in an inside pocket. Everything else, his laptop, his dress shoes, even his favorite cashmere sweater, would stay behind, stored at the tea house until his return. If he returned. The thought came unbidden. What exactly was he doing here? Chasing a mystery based on an anonymous letter. Walking away from his career, from comfort, from everything he'd worked for. Was he having some kind of midlife crisis? Should he call Sophia? Tell her he'd made a mistake? But when he finally lay down on the thin mat among the half-dozen other trekkers, sleep came more easily than it had in years. The hiking began at dawn. Within an hour, Victor regretted his decision. His lungs burned with each breath of the thin mountain air. His designer hiking boots, barely broken in, raised blisters on his heels. Dorje moved steadily ahead, occasionally looking back with an expression that might have been concern or might have been amusement. "Rest," Dorje would say, pointing to a rock. Victor would collapse gratefully, gulping water while Dorje stood without even breathing hard. 5 minutes, he would add, and exactly 5 minutes later they would continue. The path grew steeper, narrower, the drops to the side more precipitous. Sometimes they passed other hikers coming down the mountain, their faces red with exertion but glowing with something Victor couldn't quite name. Accomplishment, enlightenment. Whatever it was, he doubted his own face showed anything but exhaustion and regret. By late afternoon, they reached a small plateau where a single stone building stood. "Tea house," Dorje announced. "Sleep here." Inside, a group of hikers from various countries sat around a wooden table, sipping tea and comparing blisters. They nodded at Victor without much interest, too tired for conversation. The second day was worse than the first. Every muscle in Victor's body ached. His hands, those million-dollar instruments that could span tenths on the keyboard with ease, were now raw and blistered from catching himself on rocks when he stumbled. The weather turned. a cold rain soaking through his expensive but inadequate jacket. His breath came in gasps visible in the chilled air. How much further? He wheezed during one of their brief rests. Dorja pointed up where the clouds obscured the higher peaks. Tengboch there. One more day, one more day. Victor wasn't sure he could make it another hour, let alone another day. He had never pushed his body to these limits before. Even in his most demanding performances, it was only his hands and mind that were truly working. Now everything hurt, legs, lungs, shoulders, places he didn't even know could hurt. That night, huddled in a sleeping bag in another stone tea house listening to the wind howl outside, Victor wondered what the critics would say if they could see him now. The great Victor Reinhardt, reduced to this shivering, aching mess. Would they still call him superhuman? Would they still worship at his feet? Strangely, the thought made him smile. The third day dawned clear and cold. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, but Victor found a rhythm to his breathing, to his steps. The pain didn't disappear, but it receded to a dull background thrum, almost like music. His mind, usually racing with schedules and scores and expectations, quieted. There was only the next step, the next breath, the immensity of the mountains around them. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, they rounded a bend, and there it was, a collection of stone buildings perched on a cliff edge, impossibly ancient and solid against the backdrop of towering peaks. Prayer flags fluttered in the wind, splashes of bright color against gray stone and white snow. Tengboche Monastery, Dorja announced. Victor stood staring, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. After days of doubting his decision, of cursing himself for following the instructions in that strange letter, he felt something unexpected, a sense of rightness, of belonging. A figure emerged from the monastery gate, an elderly man in maroon robes. He walked toward them with surprising agility, hands clasped in front of him, a gentle smile on his weathered face. "You have come," he said to Victor in perfect English, his voice as warm as his smile. "We have been waiting." "You sent the letter," Victor said. It wasn't a question. The monk's smile deepened. "I am Lama Tenzin. Come inside, Victor Reinhardt. There is much for you to learn, and the first lesson begins with a cup of tea." As Victor followed the old monk through the ancient gate, he realized his hands had stopped hurting. For the first time in days, no, for the first time in years, he was eager to see what came next. The monastery was nothing like Victor had imagined. From the outside, it appeared austere and unwelcoming, rough stone walls rising from the cliff edge, small windows cut deep into the thick walls. But inside, warmth and light transformed the space. Butter lamps flickered in wall niches, casting a golden glow over intricately painted murals. The air carried the scent of incense and tea. Lama Tenzin led Victor through narrow corridors where young monks in maroon robes stepped aside respectfully. Their curious eyes followed the stranger, but none spoke. "Your quarters," Lama Tenzin said, stopping before a wooden door barely taller than Victor's shoulders. Inside was a small room with a simple bed, a wooden chair, a basin of water, and a single window overlooking the mountains. No electricity, no private bathroom, no phone service. Victor set down his backpack, wincing as his blistered hands touched the rough fabric. "I expected something more rustic," he admitted. Lama Tenzin's eyes crinkled with amusement. "You expected to sleep on the floor? To suffer for your music?" He shook his head. "Discomfort for its own sake teaches nothing. Now come. You must be hungry after your journey." In a large hall with a low ceiling, 20 monks sat cross-legged on cushions around a long, low table. They ate in silence, a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and a clear broth that tasted better than any five-star restaurant soup Victor had ever had. Perhaps it was just his hunger after the long trek, but each bite seemed to carry flavors he'd never experienced before. "Tomorrow you will rest," Lama Tenzin said as they finished eating. "Your body must adjust to the altitude. The day after we will begin." "Begin what exactly?" Victor asked. The question had been building since he'd received the letter, but only now did he feel ready to ask it. "Your education," Lama Tenzin said simply. "Now sleep." The mountains have their own way of teaching exhaustion. Victor woke to sunlight streaming through his window. For a moment he didn't know where he was. No traffic sounds, no hum of air conditioning, no ping of incoming messages on his phone. Just profound silence broken only by the distant call of a bird he couldn't name. He sat up, surprised to find his muscles ached less than expected. On a small table beside his bed, someone had left a steaming cup of tea and a bowl of what looked like porridge. Both were still warm. After eating, Victor ventured out of his room. The monastery seemed deserted. He wandered through empty corridors, past rooms where cushions were arranged in neat rows before small altars. In one large hall, Thangka paintings hung from the walls, intricate depictions of figures seated in meditation, surrounded by swirling colors and symbols he didn't understand. He found his way to a small courtyard open to the sky. The sun was high now, warming the stone beneath his feet. Victor sat on a bench carved from a single piece of wood, worn smooth by generations of monks, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he simply sat. No music playing in his head, no schedule to keep, no audience to please, just the sun on his face and the mountains rising all around. A young monk found him there sometime later. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, his head freshly shaved, his robes too big for his small frame. "Lama Tenzin asks for you," the boy said in careful English. "Please follow." Victor was led to a part of the monastery he hadn't seen before. They descended a narrow staircase cut into the stone, the air growing cooler with each step. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door stood ajar. The boy gestured for Victor to enter, then retreated back up the stairs. The room beyond was larger than expected, illuminated by skylights cleverly built into the ceiling. Glass cases lined the walls, and in them Victor could see musical instruments unlike any he'd seen before. Drums made from human bones, horns longer than a man is tall, strange stringed instruments with grotesque carvings on their necks. In the center of the room stood Lama Tenzin before a stone pedestal. Upon it lay an ancient manuscript, its yellowed pages protected by a glass case. "You came because you have mastered all the music of your world," Lama Tenzin said without turning. "But there are older traditions, deeper understandings of what music truly is." Victor moved to stand beside him, looking down at the manuscript. The notation system was unlike anything he'd seen before. Curves and lines that seemed to flow into one another, with strange symbols interspersed between what might have been staff lines. "What is this?" he asked. "The Sutrakala melody," Lama Tenzin replied, "composed nearly 1,000 years ago by a monk who claimed it came to him during deep meditation. It cannot be fully mastered in one lifetime, though many have tried." Victor couldn't help the slight smile that touched his lips. If there was one thing he knew, it was that no piece of music was beyond his abilities. "I've performed pieces considered unplayable since I was 12, he said. Lama Tenzin didn't seem offended by his confidence. "Then you may try," he replied. "Many great musicians have visited this place over the centuries. All have left humbled. Do you have a piano?" Victor asked. "Or will I need to learn one of those?" He gestured to the strange instruments in the glass cases. "We have what you need. Come." They climbed back up the stairs and followed another corridor to a small room Victor hadn't noticed before. Inside was a simple wooden piano, far below his standards but functional. It was brought here 50 years ago by an American jazz musician who stayed for a time, Lama Tenzin explained. He too came seeking the Sutrakala melody. He left without mastering it, but he gifted us his instrument. Victor sat at the bench, pressing a few keys. The piano was surprisingly well tuned despite the extreme environment. He played a quick scale, his fingers remembering their purpose despite the days of gripping rocks and walking sticks. "I'll need to study the manuscript," Victor said. "Of course, but first you must understand what you are attempting." Lama Tenzin sat on a cushion nearby, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. The Sutrakala melody is not merely a sequence of notes to be played in order. It is a gateway to understanding the nature of sound itself. "All music is just organized sound," Victor said, running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. "Is it?" Lama Tenzin's voice took on a different quality, deeper, more resonant. "Or is sound merely the physical manifestation of something more fundamental?" Before Victor could answer, Lama Tenzin began to chant. The sound filled the small room, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It was a single tone at first, but then it shifted, harmonics emerging and receding like waves on a beach. Victor had heard throat singing before, had even attended a concert of Tuvan musicians in New York once, but this was different. The sound seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating directly in his chest, his throat, his skull. When Lama Tenzin finally stopped, the silence felt like a physical presence. That, he said softly, is one phrase of the Sutrakala melody, translated for the human voice. There are 49 such phrases in the complete work. Victor sat speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. What he'd just heard defied his understanding of music, of acoustics, of what was physically possible. I'll show you how to read the notation, Lama Tenzin continued, as if what had just happened was entirely ordinary. Then you may begin your practice. The next few hours passed in a blur of concentration. Victor, who had always prided himself on his ability to sight-read even the most complex scores, found himself struggling with the basics of this alien notation system. The symbols didn't just indicate pitch and duration, they somehow conveyed resonance, harmonic structure, even the physical sensation the sound was meant to create in both performer and listener. By late afternoon, he had managed to transcribe the first few measures into a form he could read. When he finally placed his hands on the keys to play this small fragment, his fingers, which could execute the most demanding classical pieces flawlessly, stumbled like those of a first-year student. The notes themselves were simple enough. It was the relationships between them, the way each note needed to overlap and interact with the ones before and after it, that defeated him. On paper, his transcription looked logical. In practice, it sounded like random plinking. Enough for today, Lama Tenzin said as the light began to fade. You have made a good beginning. Victor stood, rolling his shoulders to release the tension that had built there. I've barely started. Yet you have already learned something important. Lama Tenzin's eyes twinkled. You have learned that you have much to learn. That night, lying on his simple bed, Victor stared at the ceiling. In the monastery's profound silence, he could hear faint notes drifting through the halls, the same melody he'd been attempting to learn, but played on some instrument he couldn't identify. The sound was haunting, ethereal, not quite sad, but carrying a weight of something like sacred sorrow. For the first time in decades, Victor encountered something he could not immediately master. The realization both infuriated and exhilarated him. As he drifted toward sleep, the melody followed him, weaving itself into his dreams, calling him to a challenge he was only beginning to understand. Days blended into one another as Victor became obsessed with the Sutrakala melody. He abandoned the monastery's schedule of meditation and chores, waking before dawn to practice and continuing until his fingers cramped and his back ached from hunching over the keyboard. The simple wooden piano, so far below his usual standards, became his entire world. Progress came in maddening increments. He would master one phrase only to find the next passage incomprehensible. The melody seemed to actively resist memorization, slipping from his mind whenever he thought he'd grasped it. You look tired, Lama Tenzin observed one morning, appearing silently in the doorway of the music room. Victor had been playing the same 4 measures for over 2 hours, trying to capture the strange resonance between the notes that the manuscript demanded. I'm fine, Victor muttered, not looking up from his transcription. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually clean-shaven face now bore several days' worth of stubble. His clothes, once pristine, were wrinkled from being slept in. Lama Tenzin placed a cup of tea on top of the piano. The body needs rest as much as the mind needs challenge. Victor ignored both the tea and the advice, returning to his practice. But the old monk remained in the doorway listening. After another frustrated attempt, Victor finally looked up. What? Your technique is flawless, Lama Tenzin said. But you play only with your fingers and your mind. That's how piano is played, Victor snapped, his patience worn thin by lack of sleep and constant failure. Is it? Lama Tenzin stepped fully into the room. The Sutrakala melody must be played with something deeper. Victor sighed, running his hands through his disheveled hair. Look, I appreciate the mystical guidance, but this is a technical problem. The timing between these notes, he pointed to his transcription, doesn't make mathematical sense. The relationships between the harmonics can't be played on a standard keyboard. Yet you heard me sing it, Lama Tenzin reminded him. Was that not real? Victor had no answer. The memory of that first demonstration still haunted him, sound that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond ordinary hearing. You approach the music as you approach everything in your life, Lama Tenzin continued gently, as something to be conquered rather than understood, as a mountain to climb, not a river to join. That's how I became the best, Victor said, a hint of his old pride returning. By conquering what others couldn't, Lama Tenzin smiled. And that is why you are here. Because being the best no longer brings you joy. Victor turned back to the piano without responding. After a moment, he heard the old monk's soft footsteps retreating down the hall. One again, Victor reached for the now cooling tea and took a sip. The taste was unfamiliar, earthy and slightly sweet, with a hint of something he couldn't name. As he drank, he realized his shoulders had been nearly touching his ears with tension. He forced them to relax, rolling his neck to release the knots that had formed there. Perhaps Lama Tenzin had a point about rest. Victor hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time since beginning his work on the melody. His dreams, when they came, were filled with fragments of the music, tantalizing him with perfect renditions that he could never quite remember upon waking. After finishing the tea, Victor decided to take a short break. He stepped out of the music room into the monastery courtyard, blinking in the bright mountain sunlight. How many days had he been inside? 3, 4? In the courtyard, several young monks were practicing a slow, flowing form of movement that resembled both dance and martial art. Their concentration was absolute, their breathing synchronized with each precise gesture. Victor watched, oddly captivated by the deliberate pace so different from his frantic efforts with the melody. An older monk approached, nodding in greeting. "You are the pianist," he said. His English was more heavily accented than Lama Tenzin's. Victor nodded. "You work on the Sutrakala." It wasn't a question. Yes. The monk's weathered face creased in a smile. "Many try. Few understand. Have you heard it performed?" Victor asked. "The complete melody?" The monk shook his head. "No one living has heard it whole. Only pieces," Victor frowned. "Then how do you know it's real? That it's even possible to play?" The monk seemed confused by the question. "We don't need to hear it whole to know it exists, just as we don't need to see the entire mountain to know it stands." This non-answer irritated Victor. But what's the point of a piece of music no one can play? What good is it? The point is the journey, not the destination. The monk gestured to the young students in the courtyard. They may practice their whole lives and never achieve perfection. Is their practice worthless? Before Victor could answer, a bell rang somewhere in the monastery, and the monk bowed slightly before walking away. The students finished their form and dispersed, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Back in his sparse room, Victor lay on his bed staring at the ceiling. Sophia would be frantic by now. He'd sent a brief email from Kathmandu before beginning the trek, telling her only that he'd arrived safely and would be out of touch for a while. That had been, 2 weeks ago, 3? Time seemed different here, less urgent yet somehow more precious. His phone, useless without service, had long since run out of battery. His watch had stopped working after the first week. The only measure of time was the monastery's bells and the rhythm of light and darkness. Victor closed his eyes, intending to rest for just a moment before returning to the piano. When he opened them again, the room was dark and someone had placed a blanket over him. He'd slept for hours, perhaps the entire night. Strangely, he didn't feel the usual panic at wasted time. Instead, as he lay in the darkness listening to the profound silence of the monastery, fragments of the melody began playing in his mind with a clarity he hadn't experienced before. The relationships between the notes, which had seemed so impossible on paper, suddenly made a kind of sense that went beyond theoretical understanding. At first light, Victor hurried to the music room. Without looking at his transcription, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play what he'd heard in his mind. The notes flowed from his fingers in a way they never had before, not perfectly, but with an intuitive grasp of the melody's inner structure. "Better," said Lama Tenzin from the doorway. "You're beginning to listen," Victor continued playing, not breaking his concentration. When he finally stopped, he looked up in surprise. "I didn't know you were still there." "I wasn't," Lama Tenzin said. "I heard you from across the monastery and came to listen." "It's still not right," Victor said, frustration creeping back into his voice. "I can hear it in my head, but my hands won't cooperate." "Because you're still trying to control the music instead of letting it guide you." Lama Tenzin sat beside the piano on a cushion. "Let me tell you how the Sutrakala melody came to be." As the morning light filled the small room, Lama Tenzin told the story of a monk who, 1,000 years ago, spent 10 years in solitary meditation in a cave high above the monastery. When he emerged, Lama Tenzin said, he spoke to no one for 7 days. On the 8th day, he began to sing a melody none had heard before. For 49 days he sang, never repeating himself, never pausing except to drink water or take small bites of food brought to him. And someone wrote it all down? Victor asked skeptically. The abbot of that time was a scholar of music. He created the notation system you've been studying, trying to capture not just the notes but their essence. Lama Tenzin's voice grew softer. When the singing monk was asked about the melody's origin, he said it was not composed but discovered, that it had always existed, like the stars or the wind. Victor thought about this as he returned to the piano. What would it mean to discover music rather than create it? To uncover something that had always been there, waiting? He placed his hands on the keys again, this time with a different intention. Instead of imposing his will on the melody, he tried to listen for it, to let it emerge through him rather than from him. Something shifted. The notes began to align in new ways, creating resonances that seemed to fill the small room with colors and textures as much as sounds. Victor lost track of time, lost awareness of his body, lost everything except the flow of the melody through his hands. When he finally stopped, the sun was high in the sky. His back ached, his fingers were stiff, but for the first time since arriving at the monastery, he felt he'd touched something real, something beyond his technical mastery. Lama Tenzin, who had remained sitting silently throughout, opened his eyes. Now you begin to understand, he said. That night, a storm raged around the monastery. Thunder shook the ancient walls and rain lashed against Victor's window. Unable to sleep, he sat on his bed listening to the storm's wild music. In the darkness, tears streaked his face, tears of humiliation, of surrender, and finally of acceptance. He, Victor Reinhardt, the foremost pianist alive, had been defeated by ancient scribblings on yellowed paper. Yet in that defeat, something new was being born. A different kind of musician, perhaps a different kind of man. The morning after the storm, Victor woke with a strange sense of calm. The frustration that had driven him for weeks had washed away, leaving something new in its place. Not confidence, he'd had plenty of that before, but a kind of acceptance. He dressed slowly, ate a simple breakfast in the common hall, and then made his way to the music room without his usual urgency. When he sat at the piano, he didn't immediately reach for his transcription. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the silence of the monastery fill him. Then, without planning what he would play, he placed his hands on the keys and let them move. What emerged surprised him. It wasn't the Sutrakala melody, at least not as written in the manuscript. It was something new yet familiar, like a conversation with the ancient music rather than an attempt to recreate it. His fingers found patterns and resonances he'd never consciously noticed before, weaving them into something that felt both personal and universal. When he finally opened his eyes, he found the music room filled with monks. They stood silently around the walls, some with eyes closed, some watching him with expressions of wonder. Lama Tenzin stood nearest to the piano, a gentle smile on his weathered face. I didn't know anyone was listening, Victor said. The whole monastery heard you, Lama Tenzin replied. Many thought a spirit had taken possession of the piano. Victor looked down at his hands, resting now on the worn keys. I wasn't playing the melody correctly. No, agreed Lama Tenzin. You were playing something better, the melody as it speaks through you. This is what I tried to tell you. The Sutrakala cannot be mastered by force of will or technical skill. It can only be channeled, like water finding its path down a mountain. Over the next few days, Victor's relationship with the piano transformed. No longer did he spend frustrated hours repeating difficult passages or analyzing the manuscript's notation. Instead, he played for the joy of discovery, allowing the ancient melody to guide him rather than trying to conquer it. Sometimes monks would gather to listen. Sometimes he played alone. Once, a group of hikers passing through stopped in the doorway, transfixed by sounds unlike anything they'd heard before. One of them recorded a short video on his phone, though Victor didn't notice at the time. Weeks passed this way in a kind of musical meditation. Victor lost track of the days, lost concern for the outside world. His beard grew, his clothes hung looser on his frame, and his hands, once manicured to perfection, became calloused in new places from helping with monastery chores between playing sessions. Then one morning, Lama Tenzin brought a visitor to the music room, a woman bundled against the mountain chill, with a familiar determined stride. "Sophia," Victor said, rising from the piano bench in shock. His manager stood in the doorway, taking in his transformed appearance with wide eyes. "My God, Victor, you look like a castaway. What are you doing here?" he asked. "How did you find me?" Sophia pulled out her phone, tapping the screen before holding it up for him to see. "This went viral 3 days ago. Over 10 million views." She pressed play on a video, and Victor heard his own playing, music that rippled and flowed in ways that would have been impossible for him just months ago. "One of the hikers who recorded it recognized you," Sophia continued. "It wasn't hard to track down which monastery has a world-famous pianist in residence." Victor looked to Lama Tenzin, who watched the exchange with serene interest. "You let her in," he said, not accusingly but with surprise. "Your journey here has been important," the old monk replied. "But all journeys continue beyond where we first imagined they will end." Sophia stepped fully into the room, her businesslike manner softened slightly by genuine concern. "I'm not here to drag you back, Victor. I just needed to see that you were okay." She glanced around at the sparse room, the simple piano. "You stopped answering emails. Your phone went dead. People were worried." "People? Or concert promoters?" Victor asked, but without his old bitterness. "Both," Sophia admitted, "but mostly me. And your fans. That video has comments from people saying your playing made them weep, made them feel things they couldn't name." She hesitated. "Whatever you found here, it's changed your music. Anyone can hear it." Victor sat back down at the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "I found my limitations," he said quietly. "And in them I found something new. Will you come back?" Sophia asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victor looked at Lama Tenzin. "Can the Sutrakala melody exist outside these walls?" The old monk smiled. "It existed before these walls were built. It will exist long after they have crumbled. The question is not where it can exist, but whether you can carry what you've learned back into your world." That evening, Victor played for Sophia. Not the classical pieces that had made him famous, but the new music he'd discovered. Part Sutrakala, part his own voice, impossible to categorize. She listened in uncharacteristic silence, tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her expensive coat. "I don't even know what to call that," she said. "Does it need a name?" Victor asked. 6 months later, Victor Reinhardt returned to Carnegie Hall. The concert had sold out in minutes, curiosity about his disappearance, and the viral video driving unprecedented demand. Backstage, he declined interviews and photographers. His appearance had changed. The beard was trimmed now, but still present, his concert attire simpler than before. But it was the change in his demeanor that most struck those who had known him before. The cold perfectionist was gone, replaced by someone more present, more human. Sophia knocked on his dressing room door. 5 minutes, she said. "Full house," she paused. "Nervous?" Victor considered the question. In the past, he would have scoffed at the very idea. Now he smiled. "Yes," he admitted. "But that's good. It means I don't know exactly what will happen out there." When he walked onto the stage, the audience fell into a hush even deeper than the one that had greeted him a year earlier. This time, the silence wasn't from reverence for his technical mastery, but anticipation of something unknown. Victor adjusted the bench, not as a performance, but because he needed it slightly higher than before, a habit he'd developed on the monastery's simple piano. Then he sat, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. For a moment, he thought of Lama Tenzin, who had declined his invitation to attend the concert. "The mountain air agrees with these old lungs," he had said, "but I will be listening nonetheless." Victor had left a generous donation for the monastery, enough to repair the ancient roof and provide for years of supplies. It seemed a small price for what he had gained there. As his hands hovered above the keys, Victor didn't plan what he would play. Instead, he opened himself to the music as he had learned to do in that small room, high in the Himalayas. When his fingers finally touched the keys, what emerged was neither classical repertoire nor pure Sutrakala, but something new, music that flowed from him rather than through him. that spoke of limitations embraced and transcended. In the audience, people began to respond in unexpected ways. Some closed their eyes, swaying gently. Others wept openly. A few even laughed, not from amusement but from a kind of joyful recognition. The music created colors and emotions that most had never experienced in a concert hall. Victor himself lost track of time, lost awareness of the audience, lost everything except the flow between his hands and the piano. When one piece ended, another began without pause. An unbroken conversation between musician, instrument, and something larger than both. When he finally stopped, the silence that followed was profound. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then the hall erupted. Not just applause, but sounds of release, of catharsis. People stood, embraced strangers, called out in a dozen languages. Backstage, after 4 encores, Victor found Sophia waiting. "I don't even know how to market whatever that was," she said, but she was smiling. "It wasn't classical, it wasn't jazz, it wasn't anything I've ever heard before. Does it need a category?" Victor asked. In interviews over the following months, when asked about his transformation, Victor would simply smile and say, "I was not humbled by the melody. I was humbled by my inability to recognize what music truly is. Technical mastery is merely the beginning of the journey, not its destination." He established a foundation to preserve musical traditions in danger of being lost, regularly returned to Nepal, and began teaching select students, though his methods confused many classically trained musicians. He often began by teaching them to fail, to embrace their limitations, a lesson he once would have considered beneath him. The critics didn't know what to make of the new Victor Reinhardt. Some called his new direction revolutionary. Others lamented his abandonment of technical perfection. Victor found himself indifferent to both praise and criticism. In his penthouse overlooking Central Park, a space now transformed here, with simple furnishings and abundant plants, Victor often sat at his custom Steinway in the evenings. Sometimes he played for hours, exploring the endless variations of a melody that could never be fully mastered in one lifetime. Sometimes he simply sat in silence, listening to the music of the city below, finding patterns and beauty in what he once would have considered mere noise. He was still the foremost pianist alive, but the title no longer defined him. The mysterious melody had indeed humbled him completely, and in that humbling, he had found something far more valuable than acclaim. He had found his true voice.